Welcome into another edition of the Roundtable. I'm Bill Priestley here with you, and today this table is much larger, as the person across from it is actually across the Atlantic Ocean. Matthias Medz joins us. He is the Director of Advocacy for the International Road Transport Union. Matthias, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a while since we've talked.
Hi, good afternoon. Or good afternoon for us, basically. Good morning for you guys.
Absolutely, yeah. Just out of curiosity, we just wanted to get a European perspective on how things have moved in terms of not only gas prices, but infrastructure in Europe and how things have kept along those lines as well. Just to start up the conversation, the last time you filled up the tank, how much was it?
That's a good question, but I guess it must be a similar experience than in the US these days. If you run, let me put it that way, if you run a truck in Europe at the moment, you pay approximately up to 2,500 euros or dollars more per month and per vehicle. And that is obviously a result of the war in Ukraine. But, freight rates have already been at a record high before the war even started because of, congested ports, growing demand, driver shortage, and of course, COVID. So the war just came on top, and fuel prices have now, as of late, doubled, obviously. And that's a pretty bad experience in North America and in Europe. And Europe is even more dependent on what's going on there because they are so close. I mean, Ukraine is in Europe, right? So more and more retail CEOs are now also announcing shortages of products and supply because of supply chain issues in road transport.
Let me run through a number of numbers that I've run across here recently in terms of gas prices. Obviously, this is for a price of 95 octane gasoline or petrol. The U.S. is about $5 a gallon. Germany is about $7.88. These are all in dollars. London $8.27. Switzerland $8.50. Norway $10.77. Hong Kong, the highest in the world, at $11.19 at the moment. Russia, $3.18. Saudi Arabia, $2.34. And Ukraine at $6.50. First off, I guess, really to kind of open the conversation, how has Russia-Ukraine really affected gas prices in terms of, obviously, they have doubled for the most part, but in terms of gas prices and just overall infrastructure in terms of freight rates?
The freight rates are at the moment they are going through the roof. So you will particularly pay more for just in time. So the shorter the delivery window is, the more you would obviously pay. And at the moment, in our industry, we are operating with a net profit margin of about 3 to 4%. So because of all of this, we're at the moment down, as our research shows, to -9. So nearly 10% down. So every truck you're moving, you have to pay on top. And you can, of course, only do that long. So companies are competing over what's out there. But more importantly, consumer prices will be hit at the end of the day. And as said before, we have driver shortages. We have more disrupting trends. We should protect the environment. Don't forget that Russia accounts for about 20% of the global energy supply. And in terms of the fuel market, the impact, particularly in Europe, is much higher. You have countries like Poland and others where basically they depend over 50%, even 60% on Russian energy supply. So policymakers are basically confronted with the reality that they have to find alternatives that our industry can use. In the trucking industry, there is about 60 million trucks, heavy trucks globally. And at the moment, North America and Europe, together with China, obviously, are other markets where also the most emissions and fuel is being used. We're talking about 1,500 billion, 1.5 trillion liters of diesel that have to be displaced at some point with low and zero emission energy, which is also why we at the RIU call policymakers to basically open up to reality and diversify basically to the maximum possible extent their approach. Because we are concerned, and members in Europe of the RIU are concerned, that there also, because of sanctions that are being put in place, there may even be shortages of fuel more down the road in autumn, where the demand is also higher.
So on a scale of 1 to 10 right now, obviously in America things are a little bit more tense. As we figure out gas prices are in a situation where people are kind of it's almost there's not an uproar of it like there's this outrageous increase of what we're dealing with. But on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate the European attitude towards the price of doing business, if you will, in freight?
In Europe, it's certainly the worst as of all regions, basically. It's bad in the US, but if you think it's bad in the US, it's devastating in Europe and in the EU in particular, because we're talking about a war that's basically at the front door of the European Union. And if this continues, and we had discussions with the International Energy Agency, it's completely unpredictable what's going to happen in the next 5 years. I mean, obviously, governments are looking for replacing so much energy that in an industry like in our industry, where you're 99% dependent on diesel fuel, it's going to be even worse. Again, we've now seen the doubling of the prices, and I went to the petrol station this morning. It's now 240 Swiss francs, which is pretty similar to euro. And here in Switzerland, and it just won't stop, and it won't stop in the foreseeable future. That's why we came up with an emergency resolution that we presented just a few days back at the International Transport Forum, which is the gathering of global transport ministers, to say there are short-term measures that governments have to take into account and longer-term measures. Governments have to basically make sure that they also look at excise duty. Taxes are very different in all parts of the world, but governments have to think about where they can influence and help the situation. Otherwise, companies will go out of business. So I mentioned 9% minus on the net profit margin. If you, for example, in Europe would already waive the excise duty, you turn that into a positive. And that's why the IRU is lobbying and advocating so hard at the moment to point the public attention to the issue. Other modes of transport won't step in. All modes are needed, and road transport is particularly needed. As demand is going up, so does road transport. And we're very, very concerned. At the same time, maybe you heard the Europeans just a couple of days back even had a vote in the European Parliament basically deciding that they want to kill the combustion engine and phase out the combustion engine by 2035. And that in times of crisis, where the same legislators go in front of public and say, it's okay to use coal and basically fossil electricity again if you can avoid a Russian energy supply. That doesn't make sense, which is why we are also calling for implementing a well-to-wheel approach that respects the diversification opportunities that you have by using all that fuel, and we need all the fuel that is out there. There's a big unknown in terms of how fast renewables can kick in and step in.
You mentioned a little bit of this already, but let me just backtrack a little bit. The last time we talked, one of your big concerns, at least at that time during COVID, was making sure that there were agreeable standards between countries so that trucks could pass over borders and could be able to move from one country to another without restriction. Is the same attitude being taken country by country in terms of how they're dealing with these financial hardships, or is a larger governing body, like you said, the European Parliament or the EU, stepping in and offering guidance?
That's a good one. We're actually discussing with the United Nations, we're discussing with the World Health Organization that needs, in times of a global pandemic, in times of a war, which is, of course, in Europe, but it has global ramifications. You need global regulation and global solutions to it. And, all the environmental policies coming on top as well, highly disruptive for our industry. How would you be able to invest in greening your fleet and renewing your fleet and new technologies if we're actually at the moment struggling to make business? So there is a big discussion to have, and CO2, just to say that, it's a global phenomenon. If you now have days of waiting times at borders, you have that also in the Americas. We've seen weeks of waiting time because of a lack of coordination of COVID protocols by governments. And if you want to provoke an answer on what governments should really do, they should make sure that you're not having idling engines stuck at borders for days and for weeks, and basically check themselves if it makes sense to talk about zero-emission vehicles when we're not even having efficient trade patterns and efficient border procedures. And that is one of our major messages and global concerns. We're, as said, working with, as road industry, with other modes of transport, with the International Labour Organization and the World Health Organization to come up with learnings from the situation on top of what's going on with the war. And, you know, ironically, we are still waiting for a digital vaccination pass that also transport workers can use. And governments, and that's the member states of the World Health Organization, who are also the member states of the United Nations, you know, they still can't agree on coming up with something and basically implement the thing. So we're really putting the finger on this to make sure that innovation will also flourish quickly, because digitalization, if you just digitalized our operations, you can gain so much more. And it would also release many of the pain points that we are seeing because of the war, because it would ultimately also bring freight rates down as it makes road transport more efficient. So we have to start somewhere. But at the moment, we only see problems.
Really quickly, we've only got about 20 seconds left here. Obviously, a best-case scenario out of Russia-Ukraine would be an abrupt end to the war. But what is maybe the first thing that you would like to see, first pressure relieved, in other words, to get some relief in the European community?
Peace, obviously. Trade can bring peace, and that is also how it all started 70 years ago when the RAU has been created after World War II. It's because of trade bringing peace. And when there is clarity on how partners can do trade with each other, it's all going to be working again. So at the moment, there is just a high degree of instability, and that is poison for doing trade.
Matthias Metz, thanks so much for joining us, and we will definitely keep in touch on the situation over there, as it looks, obviously you have a war in your backyard, but also a tough road to hoe there forward. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
All right, let's continue our show. We'll move over to Sydney Edwards with our last check of headlines.